floor. Rolling on the floor, she would weep and curse God. There, in the crevices of the bathroom tiles, she one day saw what she calls the words of God. I'm sad too. In her conclusion of the essay, she writes that if you can't see God, look lower. God is on the bathroom floor. Today, I wish to share how God is in our basement floor and the young people who come in and out through the First Street doors every night and morning during our summer and school seasons at Y2Y. As a brief outline of Y2Y Homeless Shelter, our mission is to, quote, employ a youth-to-youth model to provide a safe and affirming environment for young adults experiencing homelessness. Y2Y guests will have the opportunities to collaborate with service providers, other young adults experiencing homelessness, and student volunteers to create sustainable pathways out of homelessness and develop skills for long-term success. We provide opportunities for guests and volunteers to become the next generation's leading advocates for young adult-driven solutions to homelessness. This is quite the ambitious mission statement. And in fact, Y2Y's 22 beds for young adults experiencing homelessness comprise over half of the emergency shelter beds reserved for young people in the greater Boston area. Y2Y began 7 years ago by a pair of recent Harvard graduate students who worked at Harvard Square Homeless Shelter, our sister shelter in Harvard Square that is also student-run and operates out of University Lutheran Church. Y2Y's founders discovered that young people experiencing homelessness would frequent the shelter because they felt that they were safer in the shelter since it was run by other young adults. And some young people even prefer to sleep outside rather than in a shelter where older people who have been homeless for years take advantage of young people who are afraid, extremely vulnerable, and not familiar with how to survive on the streets. During the school year at Y2Y, we rely on our over 30 part-time student staff and over 100 volunteers each semester to provide a sanctuary of physical and psychological safety for our guests. And our guests come from all sorts of walks of life. Many of them are part of marginalized communities in our societies because of their race or sexual orientation. Those who identify as LGBTQ+ are far overrepresented in our nation's homeless population at 40%. And at Y2Y in 2021, roughly 15% of our guests identify as non-binary or transgender, 76% as people of color, and 31% as LGBTQ. The City of Boston's annual census in January 22 recorded at least 87 homeless young adults in Boston. By the end of Y2Y's summer season this year, we had 30 prospective guests on our waiting list, some of them waiting for a bed since early July. We provide an absolutely essential service to some of our most vulnerable people in our community in their path out of homelessness and toward social and economic stability. But I'd like to focus my attention not so much on statistics and data today, as much as they can reveal about the crisis of young adult homelessness in our local community, but rather on my lived experience of work at the shelter. Part of the staff responsibilities at Y2Y is to connect guests in the Boston area with resources in order to help them find employment and housing opportunities. As I checked in one day with a guest who I had seen come in and out of the shelter over the past year and a half, I started my regular routine of going through housing forms to see which applications they were eligible for and had not yet applied for. After looking without success for about half an hour at various applications, I finally broke out of my regular routine and asked if there was anything that they were looking forward to. They smiled, said yes, and said that they were planning to return to college to play music after having left a few years ago, battling drug addiction, and trying to find themselves back on their feet. When I asked where they went to school, they told me that they were returning to Berklee College, one of the most prestigious music conservatories in the nation. I was momentarily shocked, both at my own ignorance and at the amazingly talented musician standing with me. The implicit stigma, assumptions, and barriers that I put up as I tried to distance myself as an accomplished Harvard student from the young, unhoused person sitting in front of me came crumbling down. We continued to talk for a while about jazz and classical music and the joys of playing different instruments, and they taught me music theory, shared the difficulties of being a musician without stable housing, stories of losing instruments and having them stolen. 20th century philosopher and Roman Catholic theologian Bernard Lonergan presents a theory of cognition that comprises of 4 steps: experiencing, understanding, judging, and acting. He argues that this 4-step process occurs in everyone's consciousness and subconscious activity. We experience something, form a particular understanding of it based on the data, judge this understanding, and finally act on it. And he sums this process up succinctly: be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. He adds a 5th step that pervades this whole process: be loving. Lonergan argues that this process, the transcendental method, is a continual process of self-transcendence by which we become more authentic human beings. My experience with this amazing musician staying at Y2Y was a process of self-transcendence. By breaking out of my rote case management routine and treating them as a human being rather than as an object of my service, by asking what they were looking forward to, I was able to be attentive to their incredible worth and dignity. Starting with attention, I better understood that this young person was teaching me as a homeless provider, as a human being, as a fellow young person. I reflected on this new insight and I acted upon it by opening conversations with other guests, not with what I presumed they needed most help with, but rather with asking how they are and about their hopes and goals. This conversation taught me more than I learned in most of my classes and conversations at Harvard. I have been challenged to look within, to see how my values and actions are misaligned, where my stigma and assumptions lie, where and why I often treat those who are homeless as invisible or as mere recipients of my service, rather than as human beings who have so many amazing gifts, who have so much to teach and to give me, and in whom I believe God dwells. While there have certainly been difficult moments at the shelter as the instability and stress of homelessness breeds unpredictable behavioral challenges, the stories of resilience and the moments of joy and solidarity have sustained me in this work and led to a continual transformation of heart. From guests dancing in the space to offering to show new guests the bus route to their job, to guests offering each other words of consolation after difficult moments. It has been a privilege to work at Y2Y, and I also want to thank First Parish for all of your support and your continued support for our program. Moving to a little reflection on our reading today, we encountered a perhaps familiar gospel story in the parable of the Good Samaritan. A scholar of law answers that the most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. When he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus responds with the story of a person who's presumably Jewish in a ditch. The priest and Levite pass by the person in need, while the Samaritan tends his wounds and gives him shelter. The message of Jesus' parable is clear. Act towards others as the Samaritan acted to the person who was robbed. The Samaritan, despised by the Jews, is the one who shows mercy to the presumably Jewish victim. Jesus' answer to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" is the one who is robbed, poor, and lying in the ditch. 2 early church fathers, Augustine of Hippo and Ambrose, interpret this passage allegorically. They see Jesus as the Samaritan, and they see us as the people lying in the ditch. They argue that as children of Adam and Eve, we are robbed of our purity, our once exalted state, and our prelapsarian home. In order to be saved by God, we must first see our own robbed, broken, and beaten state. So who is my neighbor? My neighbor is God. The Gospels offer us a picture of an incarnate God who lived as poor and afflicted, born in a stable and dying on a cross. If God is the Samaritan and the poor and afflicted reveal God's face, then the poor and afflicted are also the Samaritans to us. In my work at Y2Y, I am not only the Samaritan who helps heal the victim in the ditch. The guests at Y2Y are the Samaritans who help me recognize the ditch that I am in and who help heal me. The ditch of stigma, of isolation, of impoverished privilege, of professionalism and individualism. The young people at Y2Y have been like the Samaritan to me, helping me to uncover and discover my own humanity and the solidarity that is so important to being human. Now, I wish to conclude this sermon with with a series of questions and a challenge that has been important in my past 3 years of working with our community members at Y2Y. Which people in our lives do we pretend not to see? How can we help shelter our homeless community members? Y2Y welcomes your support. If you're looking to support, we're always looking for donations, especially clothing of different sizes and designs. And guests often have particular needs, from musical instruments that were stolen to hair products for guests with thicker hair. We also have planned workshops in the space where Cambridge community members come into the space and share their talents, helping guests build life skills, receive particular needs like haircuts, and participate in fun activities as well. And when many of our student volunteers go home over break for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and mid-spring, we would love your help to fill in so that we can stay open and keep running. So in conclusion, if you see someone who might be one of our guests outside of First Parish, I'd really encourage you to give them a smile. Just say hi, how are you, for these small interactions remind us of our solidarity across social and economic divisions. And in the words of Nightbird, if you're looking for God, don't search in the grand and flashy and apparently powerful things. Instead, look lower, for God is in our basement floor. Thank you.
Please stand as you are able to join in the final hymn, and stay standing to extinguish the chalice.
Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night. If you cannot sing like angels, if you cannot speak before thousands, you can give from deep within you. You can change the world with your love. Love will guide us, peace has tried us, hope inside us will lead the way on the road from greed to giving. Love will guide us through the hard night.
We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.